All right, so we're now joined by Brooks Spector, international relations expert, to take a look back at the events which changed the world. It was September 11, 2001. I was 18 years old. I was a Perth student. I didn't even have a television set. And I remember just buying a newspaper going, what has just happened? I mean, and that's the point. It's a moment in time that everybody will remember. Yeah. What do you remember of that time? And I mean, where were you and what were you doing, Brooks?
Well, my wife and I were back in Washington getting the last bits of a medical clearance to be assigned back to South Africa. We were literally standing in a doctor's office.
So you were in the U.S., basically?
Yes, we were in the Washington area. And an individual came running into this doctor's office, screamed, "They bombed the Pentagon." Then she ran out. And now what exactly do you do with that piece of information other than begin to worry rather considerably about what's happening? And of course, everything unraveled thereafter. And like most people, we spent the better part of a week watching the television obsessively, trying to rearrange our travel arrangements in our cases, and trying to figure out where our children were and what they were doing and what in fact was going to happen next. Because the thing about it, no one knew what was going to be next, whether there were more such things, whether this was the last, or whether this was just the prelude to something much worse. Because remember, we were a decade past the end of the Cold War. And for a lot of people, it seemed like the world had turned into a new normal in which really, really terrible things weren't supposed to happen anymore. I
mean, and also looking at it from an economic perspective, the World Trade Center being hit, so it was almost also an economic blow in a sense. We saw that the then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan dropped interest rates very low to 1% to try and stimulate the economy. We had that internet bubble boom, also with the NASDAQ. The dot-com. Exactly, there was so much that was happening over that period, and it kind of just shook things and then created a very different type of new normal, which wasn't that great.
Well, the new normal that it created was the sense of uncertainty, that you really couldn't tell what was going to happen next. Really difficult, awful things could happen in a blink of an eye. And the next set of circumstances, of course, there were bombs in subway systems and train stations and whatever. And it suddenly made people, especially in America, think that the world was a much less predictable, much less safe place than they had been thinking for the last 9-10 years. And it created the sense that we needed to have much higher standards of checking. I mean, getting on an airplane suddenly
This is what I wanted to say. I mean, when I think about what were the significant changes, it's the amount of liquor you could carry on a plane, and the fact that you have to drink your water before you go through.
Take your shoes off, take your belt off, the whole thing.
Especially boots. Do not go on a plane with boots. I mean, this is the thing. These are the kind of changes that have been created since this.
And I mean, it brought home to a lot of people that events in South Asia and the Middle East were not entirely settled. The political and social arrangements still had severe disagreements and arguments, and they could now be brought home to us all. And it didn't matter where you were, whatever was happening, whether it was in Afghanistan or whether it was in Israel, West Bank, Palestine, or Lebanon, it could also happen next door.
Exactly. I mean, 3,000 people lost their lives. I mean, the families, the people that were affected, it's not something that they could ever forget. How do you think we respond to the incident, and how, in terms of looking back and the lessons learned over that time?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things that it did was, of course, it has now become a standard notch on the timeline of popular culture and history. I mean, there are now dozens of films that relate to it or reference it, and it's not to make light of the fact that people died, and it's not to make it's not to say this is the largest civilian catastrophe in the world. Of course, it isn't. I mean, many things have happened in which many more people have died, sadly. But for Americans who always saw themselves as particularly insular and insulated from these trends and these events, it had the same reverberation that the Japanese attack on the naval station at Pearl Harbor in 1941 had. Changed the way in which Americans think. And because America affects so much in terms of the world's popular culture, it reverberated around the world
just
additionally.
Just as 9/11 has. Thank you very much, Brooks, for joining us. Much appreciated for your time. And that was Brooks Spector, international relations expert.
News that moves. eNCA.com.